So while we're working on this slide, the things that we plan to cover today are China's standards system, so a little bit of background on how things work in China. We'll also talk about ANSI's current initiatives in China, as well as the ANSI Regional Standing Committee for Asia Pacific, or what we call by shorthand the RSC-AP. This is our main clearinghouse committee for all information about China and the rest of the Asia Pacific region. And for the folks on the phone today who are ANSI members, if you're not on that list, I think one of the easy takeaways is that you should get yourself involved with that, because it's a great resource for information. And that'll lead us to the call for action. We have some recommended next steps for the folks on the phone, and then hopefully we'll be able to leave some time for Q&A and discussion. Is the Chinese approach to standardization and also to testing and certification and other elements of conformity assessment is very different from the U.S. and also pretty different from other countries that we're more used to working with, like Europe. The differences in our system, I think, have both been sort of a generic concern and have also been a root cause behind a lot of discrete either trade issues or other concerns from our members that have evolved over the years. And so about 5 years ago, on our members and our board's request, we launched a targeted China program aimed at helping the U.S. to be more influential in China on standards and conformance issues, B, helping our members better understand what's going on in China so that they can improve their overall business, and C, trying to address individual issues as they come up. Talking about how things are different, Brian, if you could go to the next slide, slide 4. Fundamentally, we talk about the top-down and bottom-up approach. The bottom-up approach is what we're used to here in the U.S. Essentially, in the U.S. System, which is coordinated by ANSI, the users of standards, and that would be the companies or the regulatory agencies that are using standards or anyone else that's a standards user, they're the ones that are driving decisions. They decide what standards need to be developed, in what forums those should be developed, and how quickly that progress should be made. Most other countries around the world have, to varying degrees, what we call a top-down approach. And what that means is that typically there's a centralized body that drives all of those decisions. And China is a very top-down system. Some of the advantages to that from a Chinese perspective are that decisions can be made very quickly. Often there's a single point at the top, and once the decision is made, things can be implemented at great speed. Also, there's, if you have a developing economy, there's a command and control approach when companies may not be sophisticated enough to engage on their own. On the downside, the effect that impacts a lot of our members is that often you can get decisions that are made for political reasons rather than technical reasons. You might have a group of 3 officials that close themselves in a room, and they make the decision on what standards are needed or what solution is needed. And what that means is that sometimes those solutions can be out of touch with the real needs of the market. They can also, at times, be intentionally put in place to block foreign trade or investment. Our experience is that more typically those decisions are unintentionally becoming barriers rather than intentionally, but the intentional side does exist as well. And Brian, if you could go to the next slide, slide 5. We'll talk a bit about what kind of standards are used in the Chinese system. What we have here is a simple graphic that shows the different categories of standards in the Chinese system. And at the top of the pyramid are national standards, followed by professional standards, local standards, and enterprise standards. And essentially, moving from top to bottom, the top is the most important, the bottom is the least important. And so in China, essentially standards are classified into categories, and that's essentially how their utility or their goodness, if you will, is understood. And so if a standard gets a better classification, it's considered a better standard, and it takes precedent over others. The decisions about how a standard is classified come down to who develops it, how it's developed, and is often a political decision. This conflicts a little bit with how we do things, where we, in the U.S., based on our U.S. standard strategy, look at, what can a standard do for industry, what can it do for a specific purpose. As long as it's meeting that purpose, it's considered a good standard. And so what this phenomenon creates at times is a closed-mindedness to some of the applications that are used by U.S. stakeholders. It's also worth noting that China has a preference of adopting international standards, particularly for their national level standards. And incidentally, the national standards are also sometimes known as GB standards. So if you've heard that term thrown around, that means national standards. China's definition of international standards tends to be limited to ISO and IEC. Adoption of ISO and IEC is strongly encouraged. Some of the other organizations that we consider international here in the U.S., often it's not as easy to get those standards adopted, and so that can be a problem for industry or for our other stakeholders when they, when they want to see other standards being used. There's some legal and policy reasons that there are challenges to that happening. It's also worth noting that within the Chinese system, the national standards and professional standards can be either voluntary or mandatory. So they can take on the form of technical regulations, or they can take on the term of voluntary documents. Typically, somewhere in the title, if you see a T like tango, that generally means it's voluntary. If you don't see a T, it means it's mandatory. And standards can go from voluntary status to mandatory status very, very quickly. And so it's not the case that you would say, okay, this is a voluntary standard, I can just ignore it. Flipping that switch can go quickly. Also, because China is still a pretty heavily state-run economy, even if it's voluntary, in other words, you won't get thrown in prison for not following the standard, it may be the case that you must follow it in order to get subsidy programs, in order to get local business licenses, or in order to get other services from the Chinese government. Speaking again back to the adoption of international standards, China at the central level does have a preference for adopting ISO and IEC wherever possible, and they have state goals to increase the rate of adoption of those standards as much as possible, which is good news for a lot of industry sectors. Part of the bad news is that those goals and those objectives aren't always communicated throughout the whole system. So we've worked with a lot of U.S. organizations that are trying to encourage China to adopt an international standard, and whoever they're talking to may be unaware of the central government policies. In those cases, we've been able to really help bring the different parties together and get the communications going more smoothly. And there's been several examples of where we've been able to help our members encourage the adoption of a standard that's used by U.S. industry in China. And Brian, if we could flip to the next slide, slide 6. Touching again on the interagency coordination, or sometimes what we would call the lack thereof, this is a slide that kind of gives a very, very rough idea of the complexity of how standards work in China. On the left-hand side of the slide, you can see the official PRC government structure, and you'll see in the middle of that slide is the State Council that has a somewhat similar role to the White House or OMB here in the U.S. And below that, there are several ministries with different responsibilities. Pretty much any regulatory agency in the U.S. has its counterpart in China. There's a State Food and Drug Administration that would be the counterpart to the U.S. FDA, and et cetera, et cetera. What we've done is we've highlighted the various agencies that we know of that are currently involved in standards development or conformity assessment in some way or the other. And there's probably 10 or 15 different ministerial level agencies. Importantly, you'll see a blow up on the right-hand side of the slide of an agency called AQSIQ. And that stands for the General Administration of Quality, Supervision, Inspection, and Quarantine, which is quite a mouthful. AQSIQ is sometimes referred to as a super agency. It was established when China joined the WTO around 2000 or 2001, and the vision was to bring together several different ministries with different mandates and specifically to unify the Chinese agencies that at the time were responsible for inspection of imported goods and the Chinese agencies that were responsible for inspection of domestic goods. One of the key ideas of the WTO is that you can't treat imports different than your own domestics, and so AQSIQ is kind of a conglomeration of several different agencies. Officially, AQSIQ is supposed to be the agency that oversees all technical requirements in China, voluntary and mandatory. In reality, the agency is about 10 years old, and the establishment of AQSIQ didn't make the other work go away. And so what you have is an agency with a legal mandate for all things standards and all things testing and inspection, but you have concurrent, sometimes conflicting, sometimes complementary, sometimes superfluous activities going on in all kinds of other ministries. So it's really critical when doing business in China to understand that there's often multiple players for the same scope of work. And there may be multiple agencies that can impact whether or not you can get your business done or you can get your goals met. Underneath AQSIQ are two key agencies that ANSI works very closely with. The first one being on the right-hand side, SAC, which stands for the Standardization Administration of China. SAC is in many ways the equivalent to ANSI in China. They are the member to ISO. They approve the Chinese national standards and coordinate the overall Chinese system. With that said, in that role, there are a lot of activities that happen outside of SAC's scope and for which SAC does not have control over, but they are the key focal point organization in China. On the left-hand side is CNCA, which is the Certification and Accreditation Administration of China. And yes, the acronym doesn't match the name. Their primary responsibilities are overseeing the conformity assessment policy for China. So they designate the accreditation bodies. They run the compulsory certification programs like CCC or the China Compulsory Certification Mark. And they look after the various policies related to conformity assessment. As is the case with SAC and standards, there are a lot of certification programs that happen outside of the CNCA umbrella. And so for some scopes, for some products being exported to China, you may face a duplicative or redundant testing or certification requirements. Some of the examples are the telecom industry that we know of, the medical device industry. Those are two where they have two different agencies that have two different certification schemes that overlap and have similar scope. Another thing to be aware of under AQSIQ that most companies will definitely run into is the provincial branches of the AQSIQ, which are often referred to as CIQs. And those provincial branches have responsibility for carrying out the AQSIQ mandate at the provincial or state level. They're also the people that you'll face when you're exporting either into or out of the country. Speaking of who develops standards in China, typically if a standard is developed, I'll go back to the slide. Typically when a standard is developed, it is developed under somebody's jurisdiction or authority, and that somebody would be a certain agency within the Chinese government. And so some agency would need to decide that a standard is needed and kind of be the sponsor. And often the actual work of developing standards, the actual technical work, is outsourced to quasi-governmental organizations that fall under the ministries. These are somewhat like organizations in the U.S., like nonprofits, but they have a stronger linkage and stronger leadership from the Chinese government ministries. These organizations are where, as I said, where most of the technical action happens, and then once the organization has developed a standard or developed a certification program, they would put it back up to the ministry for approval. The good news about that approach is that the organizations are often very open to working with international parties. They're typically easy to work with. They typically have clear-cut objectives, and they often will want to hear U.S. perspectives. The bad thing is that a lot of times who gets the work for specific standards development is often decided in a competitive environment. So to use a recent development in energy efficiency as an example, there were a couple of ministries that wanted to be the ones to develop the standards. They farmed that work out to 5 or 6 different quasi-governmental organizations. Within our membership, there were a lot of companies and other agencies that would focus on one. They'd find one and say, okay, well, this is the organization that's going to be doing the energy efficiency standards, so we'll put all of our attention there, not realizing there's 5 or 6 others that are all competing. They're all doing the work concurrently, and at the end of the day, maybe one winner will emerge. What that means is that even though there's a lot of openness to working, it's hard for U.S. organizations to know who to focus on, where to put limited resources when it comes to advocacy. And as most companies will tell you, engaging early is the only way to get your perspectives heard. If you wait until a regulation or a standard is announced, it's pretty much too late. So that can be a real challenge. One of the pieces of advice that we often give our members who are trying to ramp up in China or trying to become more effective on the standards and conformance and regulatory issues is to look at doing a client map. In other words, taking your product or taking your objective and trying to plot out all of the organizations in the Chinese government that could have an impact on you reaching success. Typically for any given product or any given objective, there's probably going to be 10 or 15 key agencies that you need to be aware of. So you'd want to plot those out, look at what the interrelationships are, who the people are, what their motivations are, and then track that over time so you can decide where to put your limited time and resources. And finally, if we could go to the next slide. For the overall standards and conformance policy in China, we've actually taken our own advice and done this working together with the U.S.-China Business Council. And so what you're looking at right now is a client map that has we've mapped out who the key leaders are and what their responsibilities are, starting with the agency of AQSIQ. And if you could flip to the next slide, Brian, and also for the agency of SAC, the Standardization Administration of China. We'll be working on hopefully launching another 2 sets of these types of organization charts for CNCA and a couple of other key agencies in 2011, and also working to update this information. But these organization charts are some of the resources that are available to ANSI members for download and use in reference. Fine, if you could flip to the next slide. With that, I'd like to skip ahead and talk a little bit about what we're doing in China to try to advance our members' objectives, starting with the next slide of Standards Portal. Standards Portal is a website that has basic information about the standard systems in China and also some other countries. And we launched this about 4 years ago because one of the first things that our members told us is that they needed a one-stop shop for information on China's standard system. And they also wanted a way to help communicate more clearly with China about how the U.S. approach works. If you're trying to encourage China to use the standard that you want them to use, or you're trying to encourage them to be open to something that they're not currently open to, it's good to help them understand how and why that's done in the U.S. The Standards Portal essentially aims to answer 3 key questions. The first being, what technical requirements must my product meet to enter and compete in the Chinese market or other markets? The second being, how can I get early warning about changes to these requirements? As we mentioned, impacting decisions early is really the only way to be beneficial. So getting that early warning is critical. And then finally, how can I ensure that my perspectives are heard and considered in the development of either U.S. or Chinese requirements and policies that could affect my business? Behind the answers to those questions is comprehensive information on how the system works, who's who, and then links to outside resources. After launching the portal with China, we also copied the initiative, and so information is now also available for India, Korea, and the U.S. And our own information is available in English, Chinese, and Korean, so it's an easy way to share information about our system. And if we could go to the next slide, there's a screenshot of what that site looks like, and I'd encourage the folks on the phone to take a look at that at your convenience. On to the next initiative. On the next slide is our Manufacturer Member Roundtable in China. This was launched about 2 years ago because our manufacturing members specifically told us that they needed a forum to share information on key issues across industry sectors. They wanted it to be low-key, and they wanted it to be focused on the Chinese staff of the U.S. multinationals that are based in either Beijing or in Shanghai, and whose primary language is Mandarin Chinese. So at present, we have between 20 and 25 ANSI member multinational companies that participate on a monthly basis. The meetings are held in Chinese and alternate between Beijing and Shanghai. The fact that they're held in Chinese, I think, is significant because it allows us to invite in key decision makers from the Chinese government, and it allows them to engage in a way that they're comfortable. Because everybody in the room speaks Chinese and mostly is Chinese, it's easy to have open and frank discussions and to get the real story out of them, rather than what we as foreigners typically get, which is the pre-prepared talking points. This roundtable has focused on top issues like China ROS, energy efficiency, CCC, also smart grid, and as I mentioned, has included briefings and open discussion with PRC leaders. It's also, this year we've been introducing a series of workshops that include U.S. and Chinese industry and government. We had the first workshop on China ROS in February, and we're able to pull together all of the key ministries that are involved in that initiative, and got a comprehensive discussion both on where things are at right now, and also had an opportunity for our companies to provide input on what's working and what's not. If you're not a manufacturing company or you don't have local staff in China, the good news is that we also do a monthly report in English that's made available to our full members, and that provides frontline perspectives and early warning to our broader membership. So essentially, if you don't have your feet on the ground, you can get access to those frontline perspectives and information. This also, of course, increases our impact with the PRC and U.S. government. If you look at the next slide, another project that we're working on is the China Conformity Assessment Project, or we call that the CAP for short. This was launched last year because it was recognized that many of our members face concerns with the China CCC, or China Compulsory Certification Program. CCC is a comprehensive government-required certification program that's applied to about 20% of U.S. exports to China. And there's some foundational issues with how the system is structured. Notably, CCC does not allow any certification bodies other than designated Chinese national bodies to do certification or testing. So what that typically means for U.S. companies is that they inherently have to retest and recertify their products. Also, there's some problems within the system. It's not designed sometimes for the real world, so there's a lot of hiccups that are faced by companies that can either add thousands of dollars to their cost of entry into the market or several months to their process of entering the Chinese government. The project that we did is supported by the U.S. Department of Commerce, actually led by the U.S. Department of Commerce, and supported by ANSI as well as the U.S.-China Business Council. Last year, we organized 2 roundtable sessions with CNCA, U.S. government, and industry. We were able to resolve several immediate-term CCC process issues, and we're also able to demonstrate to the higher-level political leadership within the U.S. the larger concerns, which have prompted these concerns being raised in the WTO and by the U.S. government bilaterally with China. We are hoping to continue this program in 2011 with another couple of roundtables. So if anyone on the call is interested in that, they can email me, and we'll get them pulled into the loop. Maybe moving on to the next initiative on the next slide, we also regularly organize high-level PRC visits. And this is important because it helps us maintain our high-level relationships with our core partners, and also to get in high-level buy-in from these agencies for future programs and initiatives. So in the past probably 6 months, we've had 2 visits. One is from the number 2 person at CNCA, Chief Engineer Liu Weijun, and also earlier this year, a visit from the head of SAC, Zhu Zhenkun. Notably, when we have these visits, we typically will send an invitation to the members of our RSC-AP, our Asia Pacific Committee, to join the meetings as observers. And this gives them networking and face time with these top leaders. Sometimes we will also do dinners or other events to allow informal discussion as well. The next initiative that I'll talk about on the following slide is our International Guest Researcher Program, which helps us to expand the impact, the U.S. impact in China by increasing understanding of the U.S. approach with up-and-coming PRC leaders. As we discussed, there's some big differences between how we do things and how China does things. We can go to China and talk till we're blue in the face about those differences, but we found that the best way to overcome them is by having mid-level Chinese officials who are positioned to rise in the ranks in their careers over time come to ANSI and work with us for a period of between 3 months and 1 year, get to know us, and really get a first-hand, hands-on understanding of what's going on. We've had several guest researchers in the past couple of years and are hoping to have more. And this program has also been expanded to other countries like Korea and Ukraine and others in the future. Notably, we've also been able to partner with other U.S. organizations to get Chinese officials to come and spend some time at ANSI and also some time at some of the other U.S. organizations. So that's another opportunity for our members. And Brian, because we're running short on time, I'm going to skip over the next 2 slides, slide 16 and 17, and talk about some of the value-add services that we are developing for ANSI members. In addition to the work that we do in general to help overcome challenges and to open doors for ANSI's membership in China, several of our members have asked for more targeted services to help them meet their objectives. One of the services that's currently available is assistance in solving problems. If a company or another organization runs into a standards or regulatory issue in China, we've been able to successfully help them resolve that, leveraging both our expertise of how the system runs, our knowledge of what might be possible, as well as our relationships with key decision makers. Another service that's currently under development that we're looking into right now that several of our members have asked for is a tailored information package, similar to the client map that we talked about earlier, that would help a company understand who's out there that can impact their business, what surprises might be lurking around the corner, and who they need to be keeping their eyes and ears open to, and maybe who they can ignore for a while. And that's something that I think might be helpful in the future, and if you're interested in that, I encourage you to get in contact with me. With that, I'm going to actually pass off to my colleague Jessica Hightalk to talk a little bit about our Regional Standing Committee for the Asia Pacific, or RSC-AP. This essentially, as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, is the clearinghouse for China information and also for information for the wider Asia Pacific region. This is how we get information out to our members, and this is how we solicit feedback from our members. And Jessica is the staff that's responsible for that committee and can talk a little bit about what it is and some of the opportunities we have there.
Great, thank you, Elise. Brian, can we possibly advance the slide to the short? Thank you so much. So as Elisa said, this is the RSC-AP, and it's something that I do manage. And basically what it is, it's an email distribution that any of the members receive regular updates, not just particularly pertaining to China, but also to the Asia Pacific region. Currently, we have about 180 members that receive this information on a very regular basis. It's based on information for upcoming delegation meetings, as Elisa said in one of our previous slides. Any roundtable reports that we provide in the English language about what has happened in Beijing. We also provide updates as to delegation, the PAS 34, which is the Pacific Area Standard Congress, which meets annually, and it just met in Bangkok in Thailand not too long ago, about a week ago, that I just went to with our Vice President Gary Kushner. And this area really does cover special sessions, and about 20 out of the 24 current members participated in this particular Pacific Area Congress meeting. This particular group, and if you want to just advance the slide, Brian, for me one more time, just to kind of advance to that area and that topic, it really covers, it was established in 1972, and it covers a form that really provides an exchange of information and views about international standardization and activities, and strengthens the positions at international organizations such as ISO and IEC. And through this, ANSI also advances its own policy positions and gives an initiative to support the U.S. agenda in regions such as trade, energy, and environment. It gives an opportunity, as Elise had stated before, that there are opportunities to engage and provide feedback to our counterparts within the Asia-Pacific region. So that was really my overview for that particular area. I know we're a little bit short on time, and we want to allow for some questions and answers. I will say for any of those that are not participating and want to receive this information, I'd be more than willing to have you added. You can either email Elise or myself, and I'd be happy to add you or if you have any questions about that. I know it was a quick overview.
Great, thanks, Jessica. And it's worth noting that you can, if you're a full ANSI member, you can just get on the distribution list to get information, or you can become more actively engaged. So just by signing up, it doesn't mean that we're going to be demanding that you attend a bunch of meetings, but you're certainly welcome to do that also. And so maybe I'll skip ahead to the call to action. First of all, I looked over the roster for this webinar, and it looks like there's a pretty good mix of different sectors and different types of organizations, whether it's companies, organizations, or agencies. Most of you, I think, are currently full ANSI members, but if you're not a member, of course, we think you should join. And if you're not sure if you're a member or not, there's a link here to look that up, or you can contact Brian, and he'd be happy to let you know. So that's step one. For those of you on this call that are already ANSI full members, there's a couple of other things that you should probably take a look at. One is joining the RSC-AP so you can get access to that information, and consider getting involved in some of those activities if you're interested. Also, if you're a manufacturing company and you have staff on the ground in China that deals with government affairs, regulatory affairs, standards, or similar subjects like that, they may want to become active in the ANSI Manufacturer Member Roundtable in China. Most of our companies have found that that's one of the top places where they go for information and where they look for solutions when they face issues. If you don't have feet on the ground, or if that's not feasible to join as an active participant, you can join the RSC-AP to get the monthly reports out from that initiative. The 2011 Conformity Assessment Project, planning is underway right now for that. We are waiting to hear on government funding, but it looks promising. So if the China CCC mark is a concern for you, there's an opportunity to get involved and hopefully get resolution to your issues. And finally, if you're facing other hurdles in China, would invite any of the ANSI members to contact me to discuss those and see how else we might be able to help. And so with that, I think I'll close our remarks and leave the remaining time for question and answer. Brian, I know that.
Are you there, Elise? Huh? Are you there, Elise? Did I lose everybody? Oh my God. Did I lose everybody? Well, this is Brian Meinke, if everybody is still there. I would like to say that the presentation, as well as the audio for this, will be put into a public document library on the ANSI website, and I'll send the link to everybody. And I apologize for the technical difficulties that we're experiencing. We're going to get it straightened out for our next webinar series, which will probably take place in the next month or two. But thank you again for bearing with us for this first one. And we look forward to, you'll get an email from me here shortly with regard to how to access the presentation as well as the audio. And if you do have any questions, you can send them to me directly at bmeinke@ansi.org. I think a lot of you have my email address from the registration for the webinar, and then we can get those to Elise and Jessica. But thank you very much for attending today. And we again apologize for the difficulty.